In the 1840s, the most dangerous place for a pregnant woman in Vienna wasn't the slums. It was the city's finest teaching hospital. A woman would arrive healthy in the middle of the happiest moment of her life. She would give birth, and a day or two later, the fever would begin. First the shivering, then a burning fever, a swollen and rigid belly, and a pain so deep that women begged for it to end. They called it childbed fever. And once it took hold, almost nothing on earth could save you. Within days, she would be dead. Her newborn left motherless, in the very building where she had come to give it life. And in the best clinic in Vienna, this was happening to roughly 1 in 10 of them. Not 1 in 10 in a bad year. 1 in 10 as a matter of routine. Killed by something no one could see, name, or explain. One doctor figured out what was killing them. The answer was so simple and so cheap that it should have made him a hero across all of Europe. It worked almost overnight. Instead, it ended his career, wrecked his mind, and put him in an early grave. This is the story of a man who discovered how to save millions of lives, and of the powerful men who buried both the idea and the man who found it. And by the end, you'll understand the darkest twist of all. Why the hero of this story died of the exact disease he spent his life begging the world to stop. To understand what he was up against, you first have to understand the medicine of his time. Doctors had no idea that germs existed. They believed disease came from an imbalance of fluids inside the body, or from foul air rising out of the ground. Surgeons operated in ordinary street clothes. Some wore the same coat for years, stiff and blackened with old blood and pus. And they wore it proudly, like a badge of how much experience they had. The idea that a doctor's own body could carry death was not just unknown, it was unthinkable. Now, that great Vienna hospital had 2 maternity clinics right next to each other. Same building, same city, same kind of poor women coming through the doors. The first clinic was run by doctors and medical students. The second was run by midwives. On paper, they were identical. But the doctor's clinic killed mothers at 2, 3, sometimes nearly 4 times the rate of the midwives. In the worst months, close to 1 in 5 women in the doctor's ward died. And this was no secret. The women of Vienna knew exactly which door was the death sentence. They begged, on their knees, to be sent to the midwives instead. Some, when they were turned away, chose to give birth in the street. And here is the detail that should have stopped all of medicine cold. Those street births were safer. A woman was more likely to live delivering alone on the cobblestones than in the hands of the best-trained doctors in Europe. In 1846, a young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis was made an assistant in that first clinic. He was earnest, intense, and completely unable to let the dying go. While his colleagues shrugged the deaths off as fate, Semmelweis was tormented by them. So he started doing something almost no one did back then. He started counting. He treated the ward like a crime scene, and he tested every explanation medicine could offer him. Was it bad air? Both clinics breathed the same air. Was it overcrowding? The deadlier clinic was actually less crowded. Was it the weather, the women's diet, the position they lay in to give birth? He checked each one. None of them held up. There was even a priest who walked through the ward ringing a bell for the dying. Some believed the terror of that bell was frightening healthy women to death. So Semmelweis had the priest silence the bell and change his route. The women kept dying at exactly the same rate. It wore him down to nothing. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and eventually he left Vienna for a while just to clear his head. And it was while he was away that the answer finally arrived. In the worst way it possibly could. A colleague and friend of his, a professor named Jakob Kolechka, was supervising an autopsy. A student's knife slipped and cut Kolechka's finger. Just a small nick. Within days, he was dead. When Semmelweis came back and read the report on his friend's body, his blood ran cold. The damage inside Kolechka, the infection that had spread through him from that one tiny cut, was identical to what he had seen inside hundreds of dead mothers. A grown man had died from a cut he received while handling a corpse. The mothers were dying of the exact same thing, which meant the killer was not in the air, or the crowd, or the bell. It was on the corpse, and something was carrying it from the dead into the living. Then it hit him, and it was almost too horrible to say out loud. Every single morning, he and his students began their day in the morgue, cutting open the women who had died the day before. Then, with barely a rinse, they walked upstairs and reached inside women in labor to examine them. They were carrying pieces of the dead into the bodies of the living. Semmelweis called it cadaverous particles. He had no better word. The word germ wouldn't exist for another generation. But he had seen the shape of an invisible killer, and it was riding on the hands of the doctors themselves. And suddenly, the whole mystery dissolved. The midwives never set foot in the morgue. They never dissected the dead. That, and only that, was why their mothers lived. So, in May of 1847, Semmelweis made one rule. Before touching any patient, every doctor and every student had to scrub their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime, strong enough to strip away even the smell of the morgue. Not a rinse, a scrubbing, every time, no exceptions. The month before he started, the death rate in his clinic had been over 18%, nearly 1 in 5 mothers. Within 2 months, it fell to around 1%. By some counts, it dropped by 90%. Mothers who should have died were walking out of the hospital with their babies. He had taken one of the great killers in human history and, with a bucket of chlorine, very nearly switched it off. But Semmelweis wasn't finished being taught. A few months later, in that same clean ward, a group of women suddenly began dying again. He hunted for the reason, and he found it in the very first bed of the morning round. A woman lay there with a rotting, discharging cancer. The doctors scrubbed their hands before the round began, but only rinsed with plain soap and water as they moved from one bed to the next. So the infected matter from that one dying woman was carried, bed to bed, all the way down the row. Of the 12 women examined after her, 11 died. And this taught Semmelweis something even bigger than the corpses had. The killer didn't only come from the dead, it could come from the living too, from any infected, rotting tissue. It was never really about cadavers. It was about contamination. Without a microscope, without the word, he had grasped the core truth of infection itself. He had the evidence. He had the proof. He had the falling numbers in black and white. You would think the world would have carried him through the streets. It did the opposite. The leaders of European medicine didn't embrace him. They resisted him, ridiculed him, and finally buried him. And to understand why, you have to hear what his discovery was really accusing them of. Semmelweis wasn't offering a handy tip. He was telling the most respected doctors on the continent that their own unwashed hands were the murder weapon, that every mother who had died under their care had, in a sense, been killed by them. Imagine being a celebrated professor and being told that for 20 years, your healing hands had been carrying death from patient to patient. Almost none of them could accept it. It was far easier to attack the messenger than to look down at their own hands. His idea also broke every rule they had been taught. There was no germ theory yet, no proof you could hold up to the eye. To them, an invisible poison on clean-looking hands sounded like superstition. So his rivals offered their own tidy explanations instead. Prominent opponents drew up long lists of supposed causes of childbed fever. The weather, the crowding, the diet, the women's fear, anything at all except the doctor's hands. And then politics sealed his fate. In 1848, revolutions swept across Europe, and Hungary rose up against Austrian rule. Semmelweis was Hungarian, and his sympathies lay with the revolt. His superior, Professor Klein, was a conservative Austrian who distrusted him for exactly that. When Semmelweis's contract came up for renewal, some of the most respected men in the hospital backed him to stay. But Klein refused him and handed his position to a rival, a man who rejected the handwashing idea outright. Shut out of the very ward where he had proven he could save lives, Semmelweis was left with almost nothing. And here is the tragedy buried inside the tragedy. Semmelweis was terrible at defending himself. He was blunt, proud, and awkward with people. Worse, for years he refused to properly write his findings down. He was holding the most important medical discovery of the century, and he left it to others to explain for him, and they did it badly. He had the truth. He simply could not make the world listen. In 1850, humiliated and pushed aside, he left Vienna and went home to Hungary. And there, quietly, he proved himself all over again. At a hospital in Pest, he took charge of a maternity ward and enforced the very same clean hands rule. Over the next several years, out of more than 900 births, only a tiny handful of mothers died, a death rate well under 1%, in an age when wards like it were slaughterhouses. The evidence was not a fluke of one city. It followed him wherever he was allowed to try it. He was appointed a professor of obstetrics. In 1857, he married a young woman named Maria, nearly 20 years younger than himself, and started a family. For a little while, there was something like peace. But out in the wider world, mothers were still dying by the thousands in wards that a single wash basin could have saved, and the great men of medicine were still looking away. That knowledge aided him every single day. For more than a decade, he waited for reason to win. It didn't. Finally, in 1861, he poured everything he had into a book, laying out his proof in full. It was dismissed, misread, and savaged by reviewers. And that was the thing that finally broke him. Semmelweis began writing open letters to the most famous obstetricians in Europe, naming them one by one. He called them ignorant. He called them irresponsible. He called them murderers, and told them the blood of dead mothers was on their hands. He was not wrong. But to the men in power, these raging letters were a gift. Now they could dismiss him not as a challenger to be answered, but as a lunatic to be pitied. And the cruelest part is that they were beginning to be half right. Something in his mind really was coming apart. He drank. He raged. He could speak of almost nothing but the dying. Historians still argue over what it was, an illness of the brain, an infection, or simply a man crushed under years of grief and rejection. Whatever the cause, by the summer of 1865, the great discoverer was unraveling. That summer, his colleagues told him they wanted to show him a promising new medical institute. It was a lie. They drove him to an insane asylum. Semmelweis understood the instant he stepped through the doors. He turned to run. Guards seized him, beat him down, forced him into a straitjacket, and threw him into a darkened cell. He was 47 years old. The man who had spent his life fighting invisible death was now locked away as a madman. Somewhere in that beating, he took a wound to his right hand. And in that filthy cell, with no one to clean it and no one to care, the wound turned septic. The infection crept into his blood. Just 14 days after they locked him away, Ignaz Semmelweis was dead. And when they opened his body to see what had killed him, they found it. Blood poisoning. Sepsis from an untreated infected wound on a hand that no one had bothered to wash. The exact invisible killer he had begged the entire world to scrub away was the thing that reached into that cell and took him. He died, alone and disgraced, of the very disease he had discovered. And then, too late for him, and too late for the countless women who died while the world argued, he was proven right. Completely, overwhelmingly right. Within a few years of his death, Louis Pasteur showed that tiny living organisms cause disease. The surgeon Joseph Lister used that idea to make operations clean and saved untold lives. And Robert Koch nailed germ theory down for good. The invisible killer he couldn't name now had a name. Everything he had said was true. He had simply said it 20 years too soon, to men who could not bear to hear it. And in those 20 years, uncounted mothers died deaths that a single wash basin would have prevented. Today there is even a name for what was done to him, the Semmelweis reflex. It's the instinct to reject a new truth simply because it shatters what you already believe. It is one of the most expensive habits our whole species has. Now Hungary calls him the savior of mothers. A great university carries his name. There are statues of him, medals struck in his honor, his face printed on old stamps. The man they threw into a cell is remembered as one of the people who dragged medicine into the modern world. And in 2020, when a new disease swept the whole planet and the world was suddenly told over and over to wash its hands, it was his story people reached for. Every doctor alive scrubs their hands before touching you. It is one of the very first things they are taught. And every single time, they are quietly obeying a man his own profession once called a madman, a man who was right when it mattered most and was destroyed for it. So, the next time you wash your hands, remember that this simple, ordinary act cost one man everything, and that he died in the dark, still trying to make us listen.